I told my 10-year-old son his defiant actions caused us to lose our temporary home, and now he's devastated. Was I wrong to be so blunt? My family, including my 6-year-old daughter and 10-year-old son, found ourselves in need of temporary housing. It was a stressful time, but a friend generously offered us a place to stay with her family. They had a large house already home to 4 children with another on the way, and plenty of amenities like a playroom, a big backyard, a play structure, and even a pool. Felt like a godsend. After I completed a background check, my children and I moved in by the end of the week. My daughter quickly settled in, sharing a room with my friend's oldest daughter, and they became immediate best friends. My son was given his own decorated 8x8 room, and I stayed in the guest room. While my son is bright and does well in school, he's always been extremely defiant, prone to power struggles, and often rough with his sister at home. I've tried everything to help him, including therapy for myself, individual therapy for him, and even behavioral technicians. Before we moved in, my friend made it clear, if my son's behavior became harmful to her children, we would have to leave. I understood the gravity of her warning. What would happen if my son's challenging behavior resurfaced in this new, shared environment? For the first couple of weeks, my son behaved remarkably well. The testing of boundaries then began. He started pushing limits, and I had to implement punishments just as I would at home. Unfortunately, these interventions seemed to backfire. Instead of correcting his behavior, my son began teasing his sister and my friend's oldest daughter. It was a pattern I recognized, a way he'd often react to feeling disciplined. My friend gave me one formal warning, reminding me of our agreement. I immediately talked to my son, explaining the seriousness of the situation, and tried another round of punishments. But despite my efforts, he continued messing with the girls. He was taking food without asking, shooting Nerf guns inside, and these actions were disrupting the household. I knew my friend's patience and our temporary housing might be running out. How much more could my friend's family endure before they reached their breaking point? This situation is a classic example of good intentions meeting harsh reality. While the protagonist sought help for her son and accepted temporary housing, the initial warning about harmful behavior was a ticking time bomb. What constitutes harmful can be subjective, especially with a defiant child. The son's actions, like teasing and taking food, while disruptive, might not immediately seem harmful to everyone. However, in a household with multiple young children and an expectant mother, even minor boundary violations quickly erode peace. It's like a small crack in a dam. Individually, they seem insignificant, but collectively, they threaten the entire structure. The protagonist was caught between managing her son's long-standing behavioral issues and the immediate threat of losing shelter. The inevitable conversation finally came. My friend's family informed me that they could no longer accommodate my son and me. The decision was firm. We needed to leave that very night. However, in a bittersweet twist, they offered to keep my daughter. My daughter had become best friends with their oldest, and they didn't want to separate them. This was a stark realization of the consequences of my son's actions, and my inability to fully control them. The situation was heartbreaking, but they weren't completely abandoning us. They generously provided a hotel for my son and me for 1 week, a gesture that spoke volumes about their compassion despite the difficult decision. As my son and I packed our bags, I knew my daughter was safe and happy with her new best friend. How would I explain this sudden change to my son, and what would become of us now? This is where the story takes a truly gut-wrenching turn. The friend's family's decision to keep the daughter but evict the son and mother is profoundly difficult, highlighting the severity of the son's impact on their home. It's a stark illustration of how a child's behavior can have far-reaching consequences for their entire family unit. The friend's family, while compassionate enough to provide a hotel, clearly reached a point where their own family's peace and safety outweighed their desire to help. This is a tough lesson in boundaries, not just for the son, but for the protagonist in understanding the limits of even the most generous hospitality. It's like being told your pet is too disruptive for a shared living situation. But instead of a pet, it's your child, and the stakes are immeasurably higher. After that initial week in the hotel, my son and I spent several more weeks moving between various hotels and motels. It was a destabilizing and uncertain period, a stark contrast to the comfortable, amenity-rich home we had just left. The instability was hard on both of us, but especially on my son, who was clearly struggling to understand what had happened. We are now living in a 2-bedroom apartment, which I suspect has mold problems, while I actively apply for income-restricted housing, hoping to find a more stable and healthier environment. My daughter, meanwhile, remains with my friend's family. I visit her without my son a couple of times a week, and we spend weekends together. My son, understandably, expressed a lot of anger about this arrangement. He claimed I favored his sister because she got to stay at the good house. This accusation, coupled with his continued distress, made me question my next move. Should I tell him the truth about why we left, or protect him from the harsh reality of his own actions? What was the right way to navigate this painful conversation? The fallout here is immense, highlighting the long-term ripple effects of the son's behavior. The family's living situation has significantly deteriorated, and the emotional toll on both children, particularly the son, is palpable. His accusation of favoritism, while painful for the protagonist, is a natural reaction for a child struggling to process such a dramatic change. It's easier to blame an external force or perceived unfairness than to confront one's own role. The protagonist now faces the unenviable task of balancing honesty with protecting her child's emotional well-being. It's like a student failing a class and then blaming the teacher for not giving enough extra credit, rather than acknowledging their own lack of effort. The challenge is to help the son connect his actions to these very real, painful consequences without crushing his spirit. Faced with my son's anger and his belief that I favored his sister, I made a difficult decision. I told him the truth. His behavior, specifically ignoring warnings and punishments for actions like taking food and shooting Nerf guns, led to us being asked to leave. Since that conversation, my son has been incredibly upset, and it's made me question if I did the right thing. The online community, however, largely agreed with my decision. Many commenters felt that at 10 years old, my son was more than old enough to understand that his actions have consequences, and that learning this lesson now was crucial for his development. They emphasized that shielding him from this reality would only hinder his growth. Some did point out that I might have been more explicit about the risk of eviction during the warning phase, making the stakes clearer from the outset. However, the overwhelming sentiment was that his current upset, while difficult, was a positive sign, indicating he was beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. The community urged me to now focus on guiding him towards recovery and behavioral change, rather than regretting the honesty. They also raised questions about the specific severity of his actions, wondering if taking food and Nerf guns truly warranted such a drastic outcome, and whether I had clearly communicated the harmful threshold to him. The consensus from the community is clear. I am not the asshole for telling my son the truth. At 10 years old, he is considered old enough to understand that his actions have consequences, and this painful lesson is crucial for his development. While some felt I could have been more explicit about the risk of eviction earlier, the general sentiment is that his current upset is a necessary step towards accountability. It indicates he is processing the information and beginning to understand the impact of his defiance. The community believes that rather than regretting the conversation, my focus should now be on helping him navigate these difficult emotions and guiding him towards positive behavioral change. This moment, though challenging, is seen as a pivotal opportunity for growth, reinforcing the idea that honesty, even when painful, is often the best policy for a child's long-term development. The limits of even the most well-intentioned help can be unforeseen, and sometimes, the hardest truths are the most necessary for growth. The path forward for this family will undoubtedly be challenging, but with honesty and continued support, there's hope for a brighter future.